Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today where we're going to be diving into DevOps full circle, development to architecture to app management. My name's Haley. I'm a marketing manager at Flowsome, and I'm going to be kicking us off for today. A couple things to mention before we begin. You can ask any questions that you have in that Q&A located in the toolbar. We'll do our best to respond during the webinar, and if not, we're going to follow up with you via email. This webinar is being recorded and we'll be sending it around to all registrants via email within 24 hours, so you can be on the lookout for that. And I am joined today by our presenter, Francis Pindar. He is a Salesforce guru. He's coach and founder of Admin to Architect, a 26-time Salesforce certified architect, and he's been in the ecosystem for about 14 years. So he's seen it all, done it all, got his t-shirt. We're really excited to have Francis on today. So excited for him to begin the presentation. And then leading a short discussion after the webinar is V. Mihailovich. He is Senior Director of Product Marketing at Flowsome. So with those intros, I'm going to go ahead, and Francis, I'll hand it over to you. So you've already got your screen up, it looks like. Take it away whenever you're ready.
Brilliant. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the talk. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about DevOps and where I started and how I've started kind of using DevOps, and I'm kind of moving from this kind of starting off in a kind of a developer consultant type role, realizing things could be better, and kind of moving more into architecture and understanding how kind of DevOps is kind of important for that journey as well. But first off, I kind of wanted to kind of bring out the kind of the elephant in the room, I suppose, of all the stuff that's happening in the tech industry at the moment, all these layoffs happening within tech. And for me, it's kind of almost very reminiscent of back in the Millennium Bug days, where everybody kind of gorged on tech and bought lots of hardware to kind of solve the millennium bug, and then there was kind of a big drop off. And I think that's kind of like happened again, like during COVID, although people kind of thought it was going to kind of be less of a big drop. But now all the tech companies gone, oh, actually, we need to kind of start tightening our belt. So we've seen Salesforce, drop 10% of its workforce, or 10,000 or 8,000 workers. Yahoo's dropped 20% of its workers. But for me, in the Salesforce world, I think we've hit this, the honeymoon period of Salesforce is kind of over. There's a lot less greenfield projects coming out, and the tech use of Salesforce is increasing, the complexity is increasing. And because this honeymoon period is now over, it's harder to make changes in Salesforce. It's just kind of a lot more challenging, and companies are trying to do more with less and trying to kind of solve how we can be more efficient, drive better quality, and be quicker at what we're doing. And this is really where kind of obviously DevOps kind of comes in, with this kind of continuous delivery, continuous integration, monitoring what we've released. Is it beneficial to the users or not, or to ultimately to our customers, and then going back and planning and creating and verifying. But when I kind of came into this, the ecosystem's massive, right? There's loads of tools there, and it's like really tricky to figure out what is the best approach to working. So what I did when I started working at this organization, and I was a developer and consultant type role, working with BAs and testers. But we had another team that did the release part of the project, and it was just taking forever for this release team to do the release. I was like constantly going, why is this? Why is it taking so long? And I started asking questions, and I found out that actually 15 people had to sign off the release before it got into production, which I thought was a little bit bonkers, and not really knowing. I knew that there was something could be done better. And so I kind of started digging around, but I really didn't have any kind of framework to go on. So I kind of made up my tried and tested DevOps evaluation framework that I kind of go to every time when I have this type of problem. And this is the kind of the Gordon Ramsay approach to DevOps, which is what the is going on, and started drilling in, but also then starting asking the questions of why is this happening? Why do we have 15 approvals needing for the release? So I started asking questions because I wanted to know why my work wasn't getting into production, and it turned out that some of the people just didn't know why they were having to approve this this release. And in the end, I kind of cut it down, and so it's got the release team to kind of cut down the number of people, so at least it's a bit more manageable, and so we could speed up the releases. But then I was like, okay, how do we actually then look at this whole process and kind of improve the way we do things? And again, I didn't really know much about DevOps, but so I kind of went back to my kind of Salesforce implementation and how I kind of do Salesforce implementation. And it's very much a kind of this is my kind of Salesforce value canvas. And it's kind of like how I kind of think of Salesforce and how I implement Salesforce. So it's kind of like, okay, we've got this, or as an architect now, it's kind of like, okay, we've got the marketing end, then we kind of go into lead conversion. Once marketing has qualified that lead, then goes into sales qualification, and then there's sales process, and then there's post-sales support. And there could be many of these kind of different values canvases kind of coming through and cascading through Salesforce. But then underneath this, we've got all that insight and reporting. We've got the different people that are involved, the roles. We've got this kind of view of the data improving as we go through this value canvas. And then we've got all those functional capabilities, the tools and technology that we've got, either apps in App Exchange, they're in Salesforce, or integrations that are supporting that kind of value all the way through. And then finally, the benefits of why we're doing all this above, and where we can kind of drive that value and what improvements can be made. And so I kind of looked at it in this kind of way, and kind of gone, well, actually, our work is very much like a Kanban board in Salesforce. Now, if I simplify this down to kind of like little cards of work, a sales process, stuff comes in one end and comes out the other. But when I start seeing things like this happening, as a business, we start to kind of think, well, there's a lot of work at that stage. Is this because we've got a bottleneck? Is it because with this stage is just not very well defined? But also the next stage is proposal sent. So is it just trying to create the proposal is a problem? And so I kind of use this same kind of approach that we did, in business, and kind of automating that kind of business process and improving the experience of the business and the sales process to the development process. And so we've got this concept of the DevOps value stream, which I kind of used a lot later, but I did a simplified version of this at the beginning. And it's really kind of just mapping out how we do stuff and release changes into production. So, we get an email from a user or a customer going, hey, we want to do this. Okay, well, we put it in a Confluence board, just pasted the email in, and then eventually it turned into a Jira record. And then we went into development and went into testing. And then this is basically going through each of those kind of steps of the process, the people involved at those steps, the numbers of people at those steps. But then start measuring it. And a lot of companies, even now, when they say they've got a rich kind of DevOps process, they're still not measuring actually where the problems are lying. So kind of, well, how long does, so the LT is the lead time. So how long does it take for example, that Jira to be created and approved and sitting there before we actually start design and development on it? So the lead time is that time. Then we've got the VAT time, which is the value added time. So while it's sitting in that Jira board waiting to be done, or that piece of work is waiting to be done, how much time is actually being spent as a value added time on that piece of work, adding value to it, and rather than just sitting there waiting. And then finally, it's the CNA time, which is really just kind of measuring, well, how many times is that piece of work being bashed back because there's issues with it? So it actually gets in development, but actually the person responsible for the release or the responsible for the business says, actually, we don't need it, but it's already in development. And it's like, oh, okay, we're bashing it back to the board, or it's not a priority anymore. Something else has become a priority. So basically mapping all that out, just doing it on like, this is, you can do it on like 10 feature requests or something, just to kind of get a measurement. And then from that, I could start finding where my constraints are, where the bottlenecks are, because some are easier to find than others. And the person that really kind of started this whole kind of DevOps journey was this guy called Goldratt, who came up with this book, The Goal. And this is really the foundation of where DevOps has come from. And it's all around the Kata or the Toyota kind of production system or full production system of how do you improve, the creation of a Toyota car and this production line of work. And it's the same in the kind of DevOps, where we've got a production work, a request comes in, we work on it, and it goes all the way through this pipe. But the key that he kind of got across in this book was improvements to any part of the system other than the constraint will not yield any significant benefit. And I think this seems quite straightforward, but actually I think it's kind of missed. You think, oh, it's straightforward, that makes sense, but people look in the wrong places. And that's because one of the silent killers when we're doing development, you can't see it, you can't hear it, and you can't smell it, is work in progress. And I know as a developer, I got killed by this on many times, where a piece of work I'd be working on, I'd fire it over the fence to testing. Testing would have a backlog of work. It would take them a while to get through to it. They'll get to it. They started testing it. Then there'd be an issue. They'd fire it back. And I might be like, oh, how did I do that again? And I'll be scratching my head, digging through, trying to figure out how I did it to try and fix it. And it's because this kind of work in progress is this silent killer, because you're having to spend more time doing the work and trying to kind of fix the work in the process. So when we see these kind of big pieces, lots of work stuck in one area, or you've got a lot of work generally across everywhere, then potentially you've got this kind of silent killer kind of in the background, waiting to kind of really kind of stump on your project. But how do we kind of resolve this? So how do we kind of focus on the issues and these constraints, and how do we actually fix the constraints? So we've gone through, we've looked at, and I really kind of bake this in at the beginning of an agile project, or when I'm as an architect, I'm making sure that these are at least being followed, or we're kind of improving the process if we go along. But essentially, it's kind of looking at these 4 key elements, and this is what the book kind of went through. And the first thing is kind of like observing the constraint. So in the Salesforce world, it's or even just finding the constraints can be quite hard, right? Work in progress and a big load of work sitting in testing, really easy. Okay, there's a lot of work in testing. Okay, how can we improve this? What's going on? Why is it lots of work kind of getting stuck in testing? But it could be that it's just waiting for certain people to get things approved. Yeah. So the first step of the process is exploiting the constraint. So how can we kind of get the maximum utilization from that constraint? So for the testing example, it might be that actually the acceptance criteria wasn't clear enough on the work I was given as a developer, and therefore when it got through to testing, they were like, oh, I don't actually know how to test this because the acceptance criteria isn't clear. And so you're bouncing back to the person that originally asked for the work, or it's kind of bouncing back to the developer's going, I don't know, and it's kind of getting this cycle. So maybe actually tidying up the acceptance criteria could kind of improve it. But by exploiting this constraint, we can really kind of see what those issues are and really kind of try and maximize their work, try and improve the way they're working and how they're doing things. Now, if that doesn't work, it's subordinating everything. So it's kind of like, okay, that criteria, let's make sure it's right from the beginning. And everybody in the entire process of DevOps or development process or DevOps process is focused on solving this constraint and making sure they've got everything they need coming in, but also that it's really easy for them to pass it on, and it's got all the relevant information for the next step of the process, so people aren't coming back to the constraint and asking questions because they haven't got the right information in the kind of passing on of the work. So we potentially, that has kind of alleviated the constraint as well. And then the final thing we can do is how we elevate that constraint. So it might mean training the constraint in how they do things, putting them on a training course, or understanding, how they manage work, or really kind of helping out. But also it's tooling. It's like, well, actually, how can we put the tooling in place? So these releases that keep on failing, we've got a good tool there to kind of do proper releases, and we understand if it's going to fail earlier on, or if it's testing, maybe moving to automated testing, or again, just training them up. And then once that's all complete, you've pretty much reduced that constraint, and then we can move on to the next one. And as you do this more and more and more, it gets harder and harder to find those constraints, because you're kind of, well, you've whittled down the kind of the hard ones, and now it's kind of the ones that are kind of secretly hiding and kind of impacting your whole process, but you don't realize. Trying to resolve those can be, a lot harder. But at the beginning, it's kind of really simple. But one of the things we're kind of trying to do here is kind of increase the flow of work through the system. So as an architect, I'm really wanting to, when I'm architecting a solution, is going, okay, what my design and my implementation and my kind of architectural approach, how does this impact the DevOps process? And can they do it in kind of small bit pieces, I suppose, or how can they kind of work in a better way? And so one of the things is increasing flow. And there's kind of like two ways you could do this, right? Two approaches to it. One is large batches, and the other approach is single piece flow. So what do I mean by this? Okay, so all the Fs are me folding a piece of paper. All the Is are me inserting the bit of paper into an envelope. And the SEs is me licking and sticking down the envelope. And the final step is putting a stamp on the envelope, okay? And these are kind of the 4 pieces of work that I need to do to get my completed envelope so I can kind of post it in the post. Okay, so I could fold down 5 pieces of paper, then insert 5 pieces of paper into each of the envelopes, seal down each of the envelopes, and then put a stamp on each of the envelopes. And I've done that piece of work. That's one approach. The other approach is I actually fold one bit of paper, insert it into my envelope, seal down the envelope, put the stamp on it, and that's it. And I move on to the next one and the next one. Okay, so which one's better or more efficient? So the downside with large batches is you're waiting a long time until you get that finished product. So if there are any issues along the way, you haven't actually delivered it to the client or delivered it into your production org until you get to the first stamp on the first envelope. And if there's any issues, you've obviously got lots of things to fix in all your envelopes. Now with single piece flow, you're delivering to production a lot quicker. Yeah, it's in there. You haven't got all this work in progress, this WIP, and we can get it into production a lot quicker and see the results of if it worked or is good or bad. And if there are issues, we can kind of quickly get back on it. And because it's so small, it's very easy to identify where the issue is. So as an architect, I'm kind of thinking, okay, how can I break down this monolith into smaller bits? Okay, how can I, even if it's kind of like I'm building an integration and it's, this kind of big integration between 2 systems, there's still bits that you can do and release into production without even having that that integration there at all. So how can I break down the monolith to single piece flow? And in DevOps, this is kind of the ultimate goal, I suppose. Getting this single piece flow, potentially you've got a backlog of work, but everybody's kind of working on one thing at a time, or a maximum of a certain amount of time, and it's all getting tested and put into production, and we're kind of on this continuous conveyor belt and we've not got all this work that's kind of sitting in status, which also improves, if somebody wants to pull a piece of work out, it's a lot easier to pull a piece of work out when it's just one piece of work than it's in a mash of other work that we're working on at the same time. So I would say just start small, okay? Now, if you're in the developer world, or if you're an architect, it's kind of like, I think it's two different approaches. I think as a developer, it's like, what can I do better? How can I show an improvement in how we do things? If testing is one of those constraints, maybe it's like, well, actually, can I get PMD, which is kind of this free tool to analyze what I'm doing, my code and the changes, to kind of review my code before it gets to testing, and therefore potentially resolve a lot of the issues right at the beginning. But also, it's just doing that analysis, understanding how everything works in the organization, get that bigger picture. And so that you can start like focusing on those kind of big constraints and kind of whittling that down. But also, yeah, with the kind of PMD, it's this kind of shift left mentality for testing. If testing, again, is a constraint, which it was for me for quite a long time, is kind of bringing testing as far left as possible in the development and requirement cycle, so that you don't, you're kind of getting the issues solved a lot earlier on. And DevOps processing and automated testing and things like that can kind of really help it. Also, what I'd say, if read up on DevOps, really understand the subject. And one of the best books that really kind of opened my eyes in DevOps is the Phoenix Project. And I literally, every time I start a new Agile team, I make sure if people on this Agile team have not read this book, I've got a stack of them here that I basically give the Phoenix code out to them, the people on the Agile team, because it's not a manual, a tech manual or anything like that. It's basically a storybook that goes through a company that is crazily kind of going wrong. I think the first page is them saying the CEO has stepped down, the share price has plummeted, this massive project has been delayed again, but it's well worth a read, especially if you're a developer, architect. You can start reading this and go, oh my word, this character is this person in my organization. But it then starts introducing all the DevOps concepts and things like that, which I think is a brilliant book. The handbook to this goes side by side, but this is more of a kind of textbook of how you implement DevOps. And then the Unicorn Project is essentially the storybook after the Phoenix Project, which isn't as good, but worth a read. But I definitely start with the Phoenix Project as the book to start with. Also, I run a podcast, Salesforce Posse podcast, where I interviewed Vernon Keenan, who is a analyst in the DevOps space of all the kind of tooling and the DevOps ecosystem in Salesforce. And it's a really good podcast if you want to kind of get a bit of a better picture of the kind of the ecosystem, which is totally fab as well. And also, who knew, it's the top 10 most viewed podcast on Spotify and the 15th most followed podcast that Spotify announced at the end of last year, which was quite awesome. But that's it. My whistle-stop tour of my journey into DevOps, how I kind of think about it, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Francis. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw it into the Q&A. Some of the questions that have already come in, if you don't mind us getting started.
Yeah, cool.
So Francis, just a question right here is, the Salesforce ecosystem is really specific. So just the question that came through is, what are resources you would suggest first for developers and then for architects to expand their skills to get them to the next level?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an in-demand skill at the moment. Like, even just finding general DevOps people is hard, but Salesforce DevOps is like even harder. So it's definitely some really good skills to have. So there's a couple of good trailhead modules, I suppose, especially around if you're a developer around DX and packaging and that side of things. So continuous delivery using Salesforce DX, I think there's this Salesforce DX workbook and things like that. So from the development point of view, that, as well as kind of the wider look. One of the resources, actually, quite like is it was quite generally, yeah, it's a bit patchy, but generally quite good, is Apex Hours on YouTube. And they do quite a lot of videos around DevOps and things like that, which is quite useful. But also kind of like, I think if you are interested in it, just start immersing yourself in the world and start thinking like somebody in DevOps. I think, like Phoenix Project, stuff like that, kind of understand it from the business side as well as the kind of your development side and improving the way you work. And I think that's where it kind of the architect kind of hat comes on for me, is like, as an architect and thinking, well, okay, I'm making these kind of big architectural decisions. These integration is going to be this system and this system. It's event driven and blah, 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 blah. But there are actually, where is that key identifier for the data? Well, we'll work it out as part of the project. But actually, why don't we work that out as a first iteration of it, a key identifier within Salesforce and this other system? And then it might be the next step is having a button on the record in Salesforce that just deep links into the other system before they actually start doing an integration. And sometimes the project just stops there because the user's like, well, that's all we wanted, just the button that deep links over to the record so we can see the information. We don't actually need it in Salesforce. So in some ways, it's like, oh, great, I've just added way more value to this organization because of it. But also then understanding, well, breaking it up, it's going to help the DevOps process, and what tooling can we put in place to actually support that all the way through the process, so that, architecture and agile kind of work together rather than apart, that sometimes happens. So,
oh, that's perfect. And then just a quick shameless plug. We also have a Flowsome. We have a Trailhead module, as well as certifications to get folks started, which we can send out links to afterwards and as part of
I think I've done it actually. Yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
And then you can post that and really show that your expertise and knowledge in the CI/CD tool chain.
Yeah, absolutely.
What you just something really interesting, and another question that came in, and I think you mentioned something about the understanding the business value and the business problem that's being solved. Quite often is you can over design your CI/CD, right? So is it a reality for your business to be able to staff up to doing live releases? Yes or no? And I think this comes in as part of the next question, and under that umbrella is, what are companies looking in DevOps management positions? Do DevOps management positions exist really? And how does the technology that we're talking about play into the role of a DevOps management professional within our industry?
Yeah, so I think it's growing. It's definitely in standard IT or normal IT, I suppose. Yeah, there is that kind of role of that kind of DevOps manager. And it's becoming more so in Salesforce, I think, especially in the kind of larger projects, because it's like you've got this piece of, like, especially when I said at the beginning, like this maturity of the orgs are getting bigger and more complex, and the need of actually having somebody dedicated to go, actually, let's really look at the whole pipeline. Let's really analyze it, understand it. And you kind of get different skills coming in needed for that, like, leadership skills and things like that, to really kind of show the value of getting tools and changing the process. Because also people can be a bit resistant to change as well. So managing that is kind of like, and having those skills, I think, is important as well. But it is definitely a role that is coming up more and more in the ecosystem, I find.
So as you're implementing CI/CD, changing towards DevOps, there is this huge element of risk that must be embraced as you go up throughout your career. How do you incorporate your ability not only to manage the business value, but talking about the things that are really hard, right? Such as, hey, this release or these things are going to be pushed. There are certain risks with taking specific steps or everything else. How do you start managing that as you increase your seniority to really talk to the business about some of the things that are being asked or the delivery timelines?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of key things is that the business doesn't really understand. It's like the swan, I suppose, where it looks all lovely and you're like manically underneath trying to keep everything together and getting the deployments out. So it's almost like the first step is kind of like understand, showing them this is the effort we're putting through. And I remember even like you kind of get into this vicious circle of, oh, it didn't work the last deployment, so we'll do it as a manual change this time. And then the manual change list gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And you just kind of get stuck in this kind of, craziness, which increases the risk of deployments. But also the business asking for too much, I suppose, and setting, or they, not asking for too much, but kind of saying, well, actually, can we deliver this smaller and actually break it down to reduce that risk of things going wrong? And like the classic is like with a flow, right? Where you've got one flow that isn't on one single object, but you've got 3 pieces of changes that are happening that all affect that same flow, and then suddenly one of those pieces of work says, oh, we don't want to deploy that, or there's an issue with it, and then how do you manage it, right? And so that also becomes, if you haven't got that mature process or kind of reducing this kind of whip risk, I suppose, of the silent killer, then it's increasing that risk of things going wrong, quality being reduced, and having more issues. So I think it's 2-part of kind of really showing this is the effort we put through to get simple things out, as well as what can we do to actually mitigate that risk. And one of them can be just talking, collaboration, talking to each other, making it very visible what's going on, what changes are happening to everybody on the team, including the people that have asked for the requirements. So again, you're trying to kind of reduce that risk even at a communication level.
No, that's great. And then one of the value propositions that we have with the Flowsome platform is we actually have the ability to, in your specific example, demerge that change without having to rewrite the entire feature and repackage and do everything again, which is, and I think with DevOps, the focus is about velocity. And then now it's about really talking about without quality, your velocity, what impact is it really having? And then that brings us to a really quick question. Some of the conversations I'm having, and then you mentioned it specifically, it seems like the average or the Salesforce release cycle, a lot of DevOps teams or release teams have inherently built in 2 or 3 buffer days to deal with release and all the shenanigans that have to happen to manage that happening. Is that considered to be the norm, Francis, or is there something that we should be looking out forward to in a state of a little bit something better?
It's weird. It's kind of like it's become it's one of those weird things. It's like that manual checklist thing, right? And this whole approach of it's going to be hard, therefore we're going to have buffer days, 3-4 buffer, over weekend plus a day or 2 just in case. And it's like, it shouldn't be this way, right? But it's almost become this whole norm of actually it's going to be hard, therefore we've got to make sure there's lots, several days there to kind of make sure. And like there's one organization I work with where literally it takes 3 days just to package stuff up, and I'm like, holy moly, test deployments and stuff. And it's like, and it's the norm. It's like, well, it's how it's always been. It's the way it is. And it's like, it's not. Like if you look at like AWS, what they do, is it 44,000 releases a day to AWS or something crazy?
And an individual programmer clicks the button, does this automated test, releases it. There is a feature flag. If something happens, those feature flags go off. He gets a ping on, like he gets a call even.
Exactly.
And then he just takes it back. It takes it back.
And
then he does it 3 more times potentially that day.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that kind of approach where you can kind of get to the point where, even if your CEO wants to write a bit of code or make a change, it's fine because it goes through the DevOps process, all the automated testing, everything's coming out. And therefore you're kind of protecting the system and the security of it all the way through. And he gets pinged when it doesn't work, So, yeah.
And with one final question to wrap everything up, Francis, this question comes in quite often, and I feel like you're in a position to answer it really well. Custom development of the DevOps process versus managed and packaged and application and tool centric.
Yeah.
It's a conversation, you saw that big sheet there where you had all these solutions. How does that conversation evolve, and where does that lead you to?
It's kind of that balance, right? So it's always we've already got a Jenkins release pipeline, therefore we just want to fit Salesforce into it. And I think there's inherent challenges with Salesforce, right? Even to the point where just letting people know, look, users can make metadata changes in production and they don't even know. And I don't know if it's been migrated over to Lightning yet, but even users could change pick list values on the campaign name member object, right? They can do that in production. They could in Classic. I don't know if they've migrated it over to Lightning, but that is like your core config changing, right? And it's happening in production. Whereas traditional IT, it's very much of actually, it's this code. It doesn't change when it gets into production. It's this fixed thing. But also you've got the complexities of managed packages and everything else as well. And so I think it's one of those things where you need to kind of work out, you don't want to increase the tech debt of the organization, but you want that to increase the flow of your DevOps process. So you're not getting all these issues. So I think it's very much going, well, actually, these tools can work in harmony, where we actually, yes, we can use our own repository, code repository, metadata repository for stuff, locally, because that is the standard within the organization. Yes, we can use Azure DevOps for Jira, for the kind of the user story management and release, but actually we're kind of then using another release tool like Flowsome or whatever it may be to actually do that management of the environments and the releases and cascading changes back down to environments and manage that whole orchestration piece. And there's value there for it. So I think it's kind of like looking and going, okay, balancing the organizational tech debt versus the value and the speed of delivery you're going to get, and demonstrating, look, it just won't work well doing a traditional approach because things are changing constantly in Salesforce. If I make a change here, it's going to have a change all over this other place. I won't know, may miss something, but these tools are specifically designed, to kind of track those changes and make sure that what you do get into production does get into production.
And then just to your point, out of the box, these tools will require a little bit of customization to make it work for your organization and a lot of upkeep to make sure it works, right? And then I think the
dedicated people working on DevOps.
And it's always a very difficult conversation to say. It's like, hey, you're chasing after a very specific, unique environmental architecture thing due to Salesforce, and you can spend a lot of cycles
constantly tweaking it. You're constantly tweaking it, going, oh yeah, we need to do this scenario, or change the metadata in this way.
And you mentioned it too, as well as trying to find the resources for each of these unique one-off things is a little bit of a challenge sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. So even if you want to go that approach, you're going to struggle anyway. So, And also, it's like, I also think it's like starting small, right? It's like try impact, get the impact first, get it working. And actually, I'm working with organizers at the moment that has that whole, hey, we've got all this internal process and tooling and everything else. And it's like, well, okay, yes, it can fit in there. And we can get specific tools like Flowsome to kind of really speed up the process. But this is where it really helps, right? So we don't actually have this hidden cost of constantly changing my Jenkins rules and Jenkins packages because, it doesn't support Salesforce brilliantly well.
Francis, thank you so much for your time. Just for everyone's information, we have the ability to trial Flowsome, the Flowsome platform. We'll send you a link afterwards if anyone else is interested. We'll follow up with some emails about resources and things to get you started. And then if anyone has any questions for Francis or Flowsome or would like to see some demonstrations, feel free to reach out to us. I'd like to thank you so much for your time, Francis, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Brilliant. Cool. Thanks a lot. See ya.
Bye, everyone.